Hey guys, welcome back. Um, I'm a little sick, so I apologize for my voice and just kind of sounding gross, but we're going to go ahead and cover some ground on chapter 14 today. Last time we left off, super short video. We got up to pedigrees. Today I'm going to show you one of those. So here's your pedigree, and these symbols here are pretty much um, across the board. They're going to be the same. Squares denote a male, circles denote females. Rarely you can see a diamond. And then, of course, if there's a line drawn connecting a male and a female, that's a marriage or mating. And then the trait that's being studied will generally be colored, and your offspring are the branches, of course, that come down from a marriage, and then the generations. And so here we have this one, I think, in your book is polyploidy. Polyploidy is many fingers or many toes, and I'm pretty sure it's a dominant trait. Um, but what it basically will give you is 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. And if I'm thinking right here, I think the black is the number of fingers on each hand, and I think the red is the number of toes on each foot. You might have to check me on that. So here you have a mother and a father, neither of which are expressing the trait, produce 2 children, a female and a male. And their female is born with 6 toes on each foot. She's polyploidy. Uh, that's the only child they have. So now that I'm looking at it, it must be recessive. It can't be a dominant trait, or both parents would express it. These parents were likely heterozygotes and passed the recessive trait on to their daughter. So the daughter has 6 toes, marries a man, and they have a lot of kids. A male without the trait, but he's a carrier for the trait. Another male without the trait. A female with the trait who also has 6 toes, and 5 fingers on each hand. They have another female. That female has 6 fingers, 5 toes, and 5 toes. And then over here, they have another female, a lot of girls in this family, 6 fingers, 5 toes, 5 toes. So they have 3 polyploidy females, 2 males who have 5 fingers and 5 toes. The male's a carrier, marries a woman. They have a couple of kiddos. I guess we don't know if they're boys or girls. I don't really know how that works. Okay. But one of them has multiple digits. You got that little black in there. I don't know what they've got, but 6 fingers, 6 toes, they got something going on. Other guy gets married. They have a kiddo who doesn't have the trait. If they don't get married or mate, by the way, it's just the end there. The female gets married, just has a bunch of kids. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kiddos. 2 of the males have 6 toes on each foot. And the other girl they had gets married, and one of her males and one of her females has 6 toes on each foot. And then this guy here marries a girl, their kid, no polyploidy. This girl marries a guy, 2 of their boys. This one right here, look at that, doubled up, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. There, that's really cool. So that's how you look at a pedigree. It doesn't give you their genotype, it just gives you the traits and their phenotype. So your single genes on autosomes or sex chromosomes can govern more than 6,000 genetic abnormalities. So one gene can cause just a ton of issues. Most of our human traits, like skin color, are polygenic, which means many genes influence one trait, and some have epigenetic contributions or causes. So studying this can become a little difficult. A genetic abnormality is an uncommon version of a trait that is not inherently life-threatening. For example, the genetic abnormality we were just looking at was someone being born with 6 fingers. It's fine to have 6 fingers. It's not going to kill you to have 6 fingers. You can go through life with 6 fingers or 6 toes, and short of being frustrated with gloves and sandals and that sort of issue, you'll be fine. It's not going to kill you. A genetic disorder can cause medical problems that could be very severe, and it's often characterized by a specific set of symptoms. We call those symptoms a syndrome. So here's a few that you may or may not be familiar with. Uh, Disorders that have the blue line here tells you how they're inherited. Autosomal dominant inheritance, autosomal recessive inheritance, so a dominant allele, a recessive allele, X-linked recessive, X-linked dominant, change in the chromosome number, and change in the chromosome structure. You don't have to commit these to memory, but just to give you an idea. Autosomal dominant, a dominant trait that you can inherit from your parents, could be achondroplastic dwarfism. It could be compactodactyly, which is compact fingers, so small rigid fingers. It could be Huntington's disease, the degeneration of the nervous system. It could be what we just looked at, polydactyly. It is dominant. I thought so. Interesting. Polydactyly, which is what we just looked at, extra fingers, toes, or both. Uh, Progeria is one we'll see here in just a little bit, which is a really sad one. Polydactyly, autosomal dominant. I'll have to look at that little graph again. Autosomal recessive, so a recessive one that could be masked if the dominant allele were you were to inherit that from your other parent. Albinism, which is to be an albino and have no pigmentation, that's recessive. So you can be a carrier of that and have it hidden. What else do we have? A blue skin color. Wow, that's kind of cool. Cystic fibrosis. That's not cool. What else might you know? Phenylketonuria. That's a neat one. It's sad, but it's neat. Phenylketonurics can't digest the amino acid phenylalanine, and it accumulates in their body and causes a lot of mental impairment. So if you can put them on a phenylalanine-free diet, they can actually live pretty long, healthy, normal lives, which is kind of cool. Sickle cell anemia, autosomal recessive, which is one you guys have probably seen, and Tay-Sachs is one we'll talk about. X-linked recessive is probably the one that you guys all know about, or at least you will by the end of the chapter. Red-green color blindness, it's carried on the X chromosome, so you're going to get that from your mom. Same with hemophilia, which is you can't clot your blood very well. Muscular dystrophy is a sad one. You guys are familiar with that. Your muscles just become weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. There's not a whole lot of X-linked ones we learn about, but there are some that are carried on the X that are dominant. Fragile X syndrome. Changing chromosome number, Down syndromes definitely are most common. Mental impairment, heart defects, things of that nature. And that's trisomy 21. So they have 3 copies of chromosome 21. Turner syndrome, we're going to look at that. That's XO, it's a female without the other X chromosome. Klinefelter syndrome, we'll look at a few of these. Triple X, XYY. These variations in the number of chromosomes that you have for sex chromosomes. And then changing in the chromosome structure, there are just a couple of these as well, which we'll take a look at that are in your book. This one's like something like cry of a cat syndrome. It's a French term, cri du chat, which is they get this abnormally formed larynx in the young kids, and when they cry, the sound is very, very strange, and sounds like a cat, I guess. So that's how you get some of those names. So patterns of inheritance, based on your variation in your single genes, like Mendelian patterns, you can try to figure out if they're autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, which is an exercise that I was successful at earlier and then failed at in the recording, taking a look at that polydactyly thing. So I'll have to figure out what I went wrong there. Whether it's X-linked and you're inheriting it from your mother, recessive or dominant, and well, you could be inheriting it from your father as well. I'm just biased because I'm a guy, so I'm always thinking about my own genetics. Based on the variation in the whole chromosomes, changing chromosome number is a dangerous, dangerous game. Changing chromosome structure can be as well. So a few of our recurring genetic disorders, alleles are connected to severe genetic disorders. These are generally rare in the populations. If it's a allele that you inherit that gives you a disease, it's generally a bad thing. You'd think that natural selection would sort of weed these out over time, but that's not always the case. You can have a disease or a disorder because of abnormal genetics and still successfully find a mate, produce offspring, have those offspring be viable and win that evolutionary game, so to speak. Such mutations survive in the populations for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they can be reintroduced by new mutations. Maybe it's not something you inherited from your parents. Maybe it's a mutation that's just now arising. Another reason is a lot of these can be carried on recessive alleles, and so your parents can be carriers and not know that they're carriers. And then with those Mendelian genetics, you've got the 25% chance of being a homozygous recessive and showing that trait. Uh, in some of these cases, your heterozygotes might actually have an advantage. Maybe natural selection doesn't weed them out because being a heterozygote for it actually makes you better in your environment. You could certainly argue that for the case of sickle cell anemia in parts of the world where malaria is very prevalent, you can see a pretty cool graph with that. So maybe those heterozygotes have something good. So we're going to look at a couple examples of these different inheritance patterns. An allele is inherited if it's autosomal dominant, if the trait appears in heterozygous people. So hopefully based on last chapter, this little paragraph is easy to digest. Heterozygotes express the trait appears because it's autosomal dominant. All that means is the dominant trait, it masks the recessive, and autosomal means it's not in sex chromosomes, it's in body chromosomes, okay? The allele is inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern if the trait only appears in homozygous recessive people. And that's how you would try to tell those two apart. So a dominant autosomal allele is expressed in homozygotes and heterozygotes because it's dominant. It's going to pretty much show up in every generation if you're running a pedigree on this thing because it's dominant. And if a homozygous recessive and a heterozygous parent were to produce offspring, their children should about have a 50% chance of inheriting and displaying the trait, because if they inherit it, they will also display it. You could run a Punnett square on that, big T, little t, little t, little t, 50%, big T expressed, 50% no expression. Examples of this: achondroplastic dwarfism, Huntington's disease, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria. Here is the achondroplastic dwarfism. This is a person who's achondroplastic dwarf, pretty much the same proportions as a regular person. They're just a lot shorter, maybe 3 feet tall or so. It's going to vary quite a bit, but they had shorter cartilage when they laid down the bone that became them, and so they remain quite a bit shorter. And so here you have the 50-50 shot I was explaining to you earlier. This is Hutchinson-Gilford progeria, very sad disease where basically a child ages very, very, very fast. And so a 5-year-old, they go bald. They'll die of strokes and heart attacks, when they're 5, 6, 7 years old, because even though they're very young, their body's aging very quickly. So they tend to die of diseases that are generally only affecting much, much, much older people, and they don't last all that long. So that is a dominant trait. Now they're probably not going to pass that dominant trait on to their children because they'll most certainly die before reproductive age. How about autosomal recessive? What if it hides? That would be autosomal recessive. They're expressed only in the homozygote recessives. The heterozygotes are carriers, and they don't have the trait. Don't be confused by that statement. Just because they don't have the trait does not mean they don't have the allele. They can have the allele, but not express the trait. And then two carriers could have kiddos and have a 25% chance of expressing that trait, which again is the big T little t multiplied by the big T little t. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. These guys here are the 1 in that 3-to-1 ratio. Examples: albinism. Two normal colored people who are both carriers could have an albino child 25% of the time. And a much sadder example, Tay-Sachs disease. So here's your example of a carrier. Doesn't know they have the disease. Carrier doesn't know they have the disease. 3 of their kiddos are going to be fine, 2 of which will be carriers, 1 will be just fine, and there's your 25% chance of actually having that disease. Here's your example of Tay-Sachs, diagnosed 7.5 months old, dead before 2, because Tay-Sachs is 100% chance of death, no cure, no fixing it. You're going to die young. So, X-linked inheritance patterns. What if it's on the X chromosome? Traits associated with recessive alleles on the X chromosome appear more frequently in men than in women. Why do you think that is? Don't talk to your computer. Just think it in your head. I'll tell you why. Women, you guys have an X chromosome and an X chromosome, which is cool because you have a backup. If something's wrong on this X chromosome, you can express it with this X chromosome. So it's pretty hard to find a colorblind woman. Now men, on the other hand, have an X chromosome and they have a Y chromosome. Y chromosome doesn't do that much. Really, it's a teeny tiny little chromosome which says go forth and be a guy, and that's like it. So if the guy has a trouble in this little area of his X chromosome, tough luck, Chuck. You're colorblind now because you get no backup. That's it. So you're gonna see it a lot more in men. A man cannot pass the X chromosome on to his son because if a man is fathering a son, then he has passed that son his Y chromosome. That's what made the son a son. If a man fathers a daughter, then he gave her his X chromosome, which is what made her a daughter. Girls, you can only donate X chromosomes. Guys, you determine the gender of the kiddo. So mutated alleles on that X chromosome can cause or contribute over 300 genetic disorders. Girls, you're probably good in this respect. Guys, you could be toast in this respect because you have no backup. So here's the X chromosome. There's a lot going on in the X chromosome. It's a pretty big chromosome. The gene for muscular dystrophy, it's on the X chromosome. Muscular dystrophy is a bad deal. This thing I can't even read. Anhydrotic ectodermal dysplasia. Okay, I can read it, but it's annoying. That's on the X chromosome. A long string of letters, X chromosome. Hemophilia B, X chromosome. Hemophilia A, X chromosome. Red deficient colorblind, X chromosome. Green deficient colorblind, X chromosome, to name a few. There's a lot of business on the X chromosome. So if it's X-linked and it's recessive, more males than females will have it for the reason we just talked about. Males only have one X chromosome, so whether it's dominant or recessive doesn't matter. There's no dominant and recessive if you only have one. You just have one. Girls, if it's recessive, you can mask it with the other X chromosome. A female heterozygote that has 2 X chromosomes won't show the symptoms. So girls, you might not be red-green color deficient, but you might carry red-green color deficiency. And even though you can see color, doesn't mean your kids will. You can carry it, pass it on to a kiddo. Males are going to transmit an X only into their daughters for the reasons we just talked about in the last slide. So some X-linked recessive disorders. Red-green color blindness. Most of the people who tell you they're colorblind aren't colorblind. They can see colors. They're just not the same exact colors you and I see. They have an inability to distinguish certain colors, caused by some altered photoreceptors in their eyes. It's fun if you know a colorblind student, because he's probably going to be a guy. You can start asking him stuff like, is your dad colorblind? Do you have any brothers? Your mom colorblind? Uncles and grandparents on your mother's side? And you can track that little X-linked colorblind trait back a couple generations without too much trouble. And it's kind of interesting. Red-green colorblind, not that big of a deal. Muscular dystrophy, that's a big deal. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is an X-linked recessive disorder. It's degeneration of the muscles caused by a lack of structural protein called dystrophin. Hemophilia A, that's a pretty big deal. Bleeding is caused by a lack of blood clotting protein. So you can't clot the blood. It's a lot more common in guys than it is in girls, which, there you go. Here's the example of X-linked recessive inheritance. We have, what do we got going on here? We got a guy who can see color. We got a mom who can see color but is a carrier for being colorblind. So they can have a girl who can see color and is not a carrier. They can have a girl who's a carrier and can see color. They can have a boy who can see color, or they can have a boy who's red-green color deficient, what we would call colorblind, even though that's not technically correct. So, 25% chance, and he sees color. You and I look at this, and there's black, or maybe I can't. There's blue sky, there's green leaves, there's red berries. This red-green color deficient guy, there's blue sky, there's green leaves, there's green berries. He sees color. It's not the same color as you and I see. His green's a little more brown. His red's kind of not there. His blue's a little different blue. He still sees color, just not the same. These are tests you can run to see if you're color deficient or not. You may have one form of red-green color blindness if you see a 7 in this circle instead of a 29. I don't know, I see a 29. You may have another form of red-green color blindness if you see a 3 instead of an 8. I don't know, I see an 8, but I'm also not colorblind, so it'd be different if, I don't know. Let me know what you see, it'd be interesting. So here you have it. Look at this thing. This is cool right here. I won't go too long into this. I'll let you guys read this in your book. But this is neat because this is a pedigree. And normally you can't get this detailed pedigrees going on right here. But the thing with this is it's royal families. Royal families are cool because they keep track of everybody, who marries everybody, what kids they have. And the really cool thing about royal families is they inbreed. Check this out. Father, mother, child, brother, child, cousins, married. Now we're talking about a pedigree that can get crazy. So, female carriers for hemophilia. Affected males for hemophilia. Normal female, normal male. So we start way up here with our female carrier, Victoria. 1819, 1910. Okay, Victoria has some kids. Apparently a lot of them. Royal families even have little squiggly lines in their pedigrees. I don't know what that means, but it's freaking me out. Okay, Alice, I don't know. Of Hesse, I don't know. She's a carrier too. So is Beatrice. Leopold, the Duke of Albany, has hemophilia, but he still had kids. It looks like there's a line coming down from him, so hey, look at that. And one of his kids was a carrier, a female carrier who went on to have a son. That son had hemophilia. Here's another one. Beatrice was a carrier, had 2 affected males and a female carrier. That female carrier had an affected male later. So you can track a trait through these generations. Kind of amazing and kind of weird. So yeah, inbreeding, fascinating, but not a good idea because it keeps bad alleles in your family. So let's stop there and we'll pick up with 14.5 next time. So